What happens to NATO if the US steps back? Well, we might have the first concrete answer to that, a list of military cuts that could reshape the alliance, and it doesn't make for easy reading here in Europe. After hints and warnings, the US is now detailing plans to scale back its military contribution to NATO. So here are the specifics, according to a report from Die Welt here in Germany. Among the substantial reductions to NATO's so-called force elements are the withdrawal of one of the existing 2 US aircraft carrier strike groups, 2 bomber formations will be reduced to 1, a total of 153 F-16 and F-15 fighter jets goes down to 99, all long-range reconnaissance drones will be withdrawn and the number of armed drones nearly halved, and the number of tanker refuelling aircraft and maritime patrol planes will also be significantly reduced. To help us make sense of this, DW correspondent Teri Schultz in Brussels. Teri, hi there. What more can you tell us about this information from Die Welt?
Well, Jared, we should point out right off the top that this was a classified leak to Die Welt, and I haven't seen any other news organization with quite so much detail. So we can't really confirm that this is exactly what the U.S. has informed allies about. A source did tell me, though, and other conversations that I've had indicate that these are at least the categories in which the U.S. has told the other NATO countries that it is going to reduce its contributions to what's called the NATO force model. Now, that is the force that would react most quickly in times of crisis. So the resources that would be called upon immediately if something were to happen. And, you know, the only thing that we've seen on the record about this, it comes from the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He's the man in charge of making sure that NATO has everything it needs in the right places in case there should be an attack. And he basically backed up the U.S. Making these reductions. He said, very much in line with the Trump administration's thinking, that there's been an unhealthy codependence, he called it. He said that, you know, Europe has been relying too much on the U.S., specifically in the case of this NATO force model, the rapid reaction force. And he also said that he believes that European countries can make up the difference in many areas of what the U.S. has said it's going to cut. They simply have to do it. They have to look at their own national resources and hand them over to NATO in this planning. So that's the only thing that we've seen on the record.
OK, that's a good point you've made there. If the details are accurate, though, how big of a problem will this be for NATO in terms of capabilities?
I think some reductions will be more difficult than others for the Europeans to fill the gaps. You know, we talk constantly about how Europe is behind on producing some weapons systems, weapons fast enough, and so that's surely going to come into play here. But from what I've seen, it seems that that actually the withdrawal of these drones is going to be a problem. If that's true, that such a high number are going to be cut, that perhaps European countries don't have such advanced drones to take the place of them. You know, one of the real weaknesses on the European side of NATO is reconnaissance, is what's called ISR, and that is intelligence, reconnaissance, and what's ISR? Hold on, I'm getting mixed up here. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance. And so some of these drones do those jobs, and Europe will not be able to immediately refill that capability. But again, if we're looking at the Supreme Allied Commander, he said that some of the areas where Europe can very quickly refill these gaps are in manned and unmanned aircraft, so that could include some drones. And he said, and also on the naval side. So there are some ships that European countries possess that he would like to see then committed to this NATO force model.
Yeah, Teri, lots of differing timelines there depending on what the item in the list is, but how much time will European governments have actually to fill any gaps?
That's a good question, and I think the answer will be not enough. I have not seen anywhere that the U.S. even told allies when they will be withdrawing these capabilities. Not just that we don't know it, but everything I've seen written about these meetings is that they weren't given an exact timeline. Now, what allies have asked for consistently is that nothing be abrupt. They acknowledge that they don't have everything that the U.S. has, that they would not be able to simply, produce in any short amount of time the advanced weapons and weapon systems that the U.S. possesses. And so they have asked that they be given some time. Now, the U.S. timeline is undoubtedly shorter than the Europeans would need in many of these areas to stand up production lines. But from everything that I've seen, again, we just don't know.
Teri, you were talking about this a little bit earlier. Just remind us again, though, why the US is or could be removing these resources from NATO, because isn't it also in Washington's interest to keep the alliance strong?
That's what the Europeans would like Washington to believe, of course. But the Trump administration has said since the beginning, in fact, since the last Trump administration, that it didn't want European countries to be so heavily dependent on the U.S., neither financially, carrying the burden, the financial burden of NATO, nor technologically. And so they have warned that they will be scaling back. And in fact, the U.S. ambassador to NATO said in just his first months here serving here in Brussels that the U.S. was looking at what cuts it was going to make and that it intended to do it quite quickly. And so that didn't happen at the Hague Summit last summer. No large cuts were announced, and I think Europeans breathed a sigh of relief. But then this meeting came, and this was now exactly 2 weeks ago, this meeting was held in Brussels while the NATO foreign ministers were meeting in Sweden, and we were there at that meeting in Sweden while the actual information on this was being given to allies at a lower level back here in Brussels. It was the defense policy, a meeting of the defense policy director, something that doesn't normally get a lot of attention. But they were given the first warnings about this, from what we understand. But that was a closed meeting, and there was really not a lot of reporting out of that meeting. But now NATO's military headquarters, SHAPE, has held a conference this week to talk about what is needed to keep this NATO force model beefed up, and that is where the cuts were reinforced. And those comments that I mentioned coming out of the Supreme Allied Commander were after that meeting.
Teri, one of the specifics in this Die Welt article is them reporting that the US wants to keep filling all key command positions in NATO. Can you lead an alliance that you're gradually moving away from?
We'll see, because it will be reassuring for European allies if that is true, because there have also been some very real concerns that the U.S. would also start withdrawing from some of those top positions in the military commands, including even the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, which is the most important military position in Europe and has always been held by an American. But when Trump came in again, there was a lot of talk that he may decide he simply doesn't want to hold that position. He doesn't want to take that much responsibility over NATO and over Europe's defense. So it was very reassuring when they did go ahead and fill this Supreme Allied Commander position. And if that's true, that may be the only bright spot for Europeans in this report.
Teri, just a bit over a month away from the NATO summit in Ankara, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, confirmed yesterday that Donald Trump is expected to attend. Rubio was also questioning Congress earlier this week about the Trump administration's commitment to the alliance. Let's have a listen.
So sitting here with, I'm sure, many leaders across Europe within NATO and many leaders beyond, including Vladimir Putin, potentially watching the words and listening to the words that you are saying, can you reassure our NATO allies and make it clear to Vladimir Putin that if a NATO ally is attacked and Article 5 is invoked, that we will defend them?
The United States is still in the NATO alliance, and we'll be there in Turkey to talk about all of these topics. The president himself will be attending the next NATO a meeting of heads of state where all these points will be made clear. We're still in NATO, but NATO needs significant changes, and the president has made that clear. So I think the next meeting of NATO in Turkey in July is probably the most important meeting in NATO's history, because there's some things here that need to be cleared up.
Teri, Rubio saying NATO needs significant changes. Could this, what we're talking about today, be a way to pressure allies to contribute more ahead of these talks in Ankara, or are these reported cuts happening no matter what?
Well, first of all, let's address the point that Rubio didn't just say yes. That's what every other ally in NATO would have liked to hear, that she says, can you assure our allies that if Article 5 is invoked in case of an attack, that the U.S. will defend them? In none of that answer did Rubio say, absolutely, of course, don't worry, of course we support Article 5, of course we'll be there, and then we've got all of these other issues. He never said that. So I think that is probably very concerning. And yeah, as to the rest of your question, whether the positions on this, and even that answer where he sort of left Article 5 commitment up in the air, certainly it's to pressure NATO allies, as so many of these moves are. But I don't think that they're going to negotiate these cuts that we've already heard announced. They don't have to negotiate them. They can decide unilaterally to pull whatever they want out of NATO, as unwise as even many Republicans on the Hill have been telling the administration, don't do that. That hurts our own security. You know, you never know when we're going to need the allies, and we can't undercut them. But that hasn't seemed to really resonate with the Trump administration. They are planning to make these cuts. And going back to the Supreme Allied Commander's statement, he said that it's understandable that the U.S. wants to pull these resources out of Europe where there is not an active war, and make them more available for where the U.S. is potentially or is already conducting a war. So they don't need to leave their resources in Europe if they don't want to. So I think that there's not going to be negotiation over these cuts. What they could be doing is trying to pressure the allies to fill these gaps that we've been talking about even more quickly than they might otherwise do. And that's what the Supreme Allied Commander was saying as well. He was saying, look, these could be filled really quickly if allies just look at what they've got and tell me I can use it if we need it. So I think you will see a lot of discussion on this. There are a couple of important meetings coming up before The Hague just next week. The defense ministers from the European Union are going to be meeting in an informal meeting in Cyprus, and I will be there, so I'm advertising. Watch us for that. And then the defense ministers will meet at NATO later in June, in the middle of June, and that will be the last meeting before The Hague, where they sort of try to tee everything up. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure at both of those meetings for them to get together and decide, what have we got? What can we use to fill these gaps so that, you know, as you heard there in that clip from Washington, Vladimir Putin doesn't get the idea that there are, you know, holes he can walk through now in our collective defense. That's really important. It's not only that Trump is sending this message to the European allies, it's that he's also sending this message to Moscow. And that's something that, of course, keeps European nerves on edge all the time.
Thanks a lot for that, Teri. That's DW correspondent Teri Schultz speaking to us from Brussels. Just to remind you, here's a list of the reported US military cuts to NATO's so-called force elements as reported in Die Welt. The withdrawal of one of the existing 2 US aircraft carrier strike groups. 2 bomber formations will be reduced to 1. A total of 153 F-16 and F-15 fighter jets goes down to 99. All long-range reconnaissance drones will be withdrawn, and the number of armed drones nearly halved. And the number of tanker refuelling aircraft and maritime patrol planes will also be significantly reduced. Phil Dickinson can help us make sense of this. He's Deputy Director with the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Welcome to you. Let's start with the basics, Phil. If you were a European leader looking through that list, which of the capabilities reportedly being cut would worry you the most from a purely military point of view?
Thanks very much. Yeah, great to join the program. The hardest things to replace are the strategic assets that the US can provide. You know, there has been a lot of talk about burden shifting, NATO 3.0, et cetera, and the Americans have gotten European buy-in to that by emphasizing that it is about withdrawing US conventional support to Europe so that Europeans can increase the size of their land forces in particular and to sort of just grow their arsenals. But it takes a long time to develop the defense industry and put orders in to replace, you know, carrier strike groups, to replace bomber units. The strategic assets that the US has in Europe, that is really what most deters Russia. Russia is most afraid of US being able to respond with overwhelming force to any moves in Europe. And the big ticket items that this is being reported that the US is drawing back, that's going to be what is most concerning to European leaders, because they can't just click their fingers and sort of put those assets back into the field so quickly.
So are you saying essentially that these cuts, if they do end up happening, will affect NATO's ability to potentially deter an adversary like Russia?
Deterrence is a kind of a psychological game in many respects, and there are two ways in which you deter. You can deter by denying the enemy the success on the battlefield, and you can deter by convincing them that any action they take will result in overwhelming punishment. It's about signals that you send. And by removing assets and by making your defense posture weaker, perhaps in the short to medium term, even if there is good talk about Europe taking on the responsibilities in the longer term, it's pretty undeniable that in the short term, this makes European deterrence weaker. And for an adversary as unpredictable, as cynical as Vladimir Putin, where the battlefield in Ukraine is evolving, things aren't necessarily going his way, I think there is a real risk that Vladimir Putin reads these and takes signals to say, well, if I'm not happy with how things are going in Ukraine, I can shake things up by testing NATO's resolve. And what better time to do that than at a time when the United States is signaling in clear terms that it is looking to step back as a security guarantor in Europe.
Let's think about a real crisis scenario now with a weaker defence posture, as you've just outlined. Say, for example, NATO needing to respond quickly on its eastern flank. What difference would fewer US tankers, drones and naval units make on the ground, do you think?
Depends on the kind of incident that we're talking about here. But if it's sort of the hypothetical Russia making a small land grab in Estonia or a Baltic nation or a disputed territory somewhere where they claim Russian ethnic Russians are being persecuted, it just makes it more tempting that you can go in, you can act quickly and decisively and get out without with a lower expectation of overwhelming and immediate response that is going to entangle you in a much larger conflict that you don't want to get involved in. It makes it, a juicier target. Russia's biggest strategic interest here is in finding ways to fracture the alliance, and by sort of nibbling around the edges and pushing the line, makes it it raises the risks and the danger that Russia sees strategic advantage in making some quick attempted land grab that allies feel less empowered to respond quickly and with overwhelming force.
Phil, something stood out to me, and I want to ask you about that. It's about drones. There's a big reduction there at a time when Europe is still really building up that capability, of course, with valuable insights and know-how from Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Slightly mixed thoughts personally on this. It's interesting, as you say, drones are the very much in fashion militarily right now because Ukraine has shown just how valuable they are on the battlefield, and the Ukrainian ingenuity in its innovation on drones has really helped change the battlefield dynamics in Ukraine. So any kind of stepping back in terms of provision of drone support to Europe is a worry and sends a worrying signal. Conversely, I think it's one of the assets that it is easier for Europeans to produce at scale and speed because Ukraine are the world leaders now in military applications of drones. And you're seeing that in the way that the Gulf countries who need to protect themselves from Iranian Shaheds are turning to Ukraine for help, more so than the United States, for instance. So again, it's a concerning political signal, I think slightly less of a direct, immediate military significance, and one that's maybe easier for Europeans to step up and fill a capability gap.
Phil, looking ahead, what do you think this all means for the future of NATO? Do you think we're moving to a more European-led alliance?
It's pretty unmistakable that that is the US's intention. The administration has talked repeatedly over recent months about this being NATO 3.0. This is a new era of NATO where Europeans take on greater share of the burden. As I said earlier, previously that was hoped and thought that that would be focused on conventional deterrence. This is obviously spreading out further. I think that these are not necessarily military decisions alone that is driving this. I think there is politics here. And I think the politics is that this is the US administration that is angry with Europe. It is signaling its anger with Europe in specific ways. And that I think Europeans recognize the value in having a stronger European pillar, but they want it to be done steadily in a coordinated fashion, etc. I think for some in the US administration, that is a byword for European stalling, shirking the responsibility to help facilitate this burden shifting. And so what is required is shock therapy, is to move fast and maybe make Europeans realize in a pretty dramatic and visceral way that we're serious about this. The NATO summit is coming up, so let's lock this in at the NATO summit, and then we can, avert any European stalling. I think that is part of what is going on, and part of that is being driven by the politics at the moment, which are very difficult, and that has been provoked by Greenland, by response to Iran, all of these kind of things which we're all very familiar with.
Appreciate your insights today, Phil. Thanks a lot for that. Phil Dickinson is Deputy Director with the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington.
Pleasure.
And now it's time for your reactions. We'd love to hear what you think about anything Teri or Phil have had to say here on NATO. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. I'm Jared Reid in Berlin. Thanks for watching.